The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, to you all hearts open, all desires known, and from you no secrets are hidden. We ask that you cleanse our hearts so that we might be particularly present to you as we gather in your spirit and as your body on earth to spend time with the way you were when you lived 2,000 years ago, particularly in such a fraught and difficult evening. And this we pray that you might move our hearts and move our heads, that we might be followers of you. And this we pray even in the power of your Spirit. Amen. Well, I'm on the verge of canceling class now that I find out you like my suit. Today we're we're playing around with the Bible, so trying to figure out what is best. Is that good or bad for all of you? Not great. Okay. Dan, will you go turn the light off in there and then flick the lights on outside around the edge? Once the parish administrator, always the parish administrator.
John's getting that one. John's getting that one.
John's got it. Okay, so let's just start off with a little bit about where are we-ness, and then we're going to get into what happened-ness. Here we are. We're going to be talking about the Garden of Gethsemane. I just want to review here. So this is the Mount of Olives, and this is Mount Moriah where Jerusalem is, right? And here's the whole area of the Temple Mount. And this little thing here, you can see where it says Kidron Valley. There's a little valley that runs. This is a kind of hillside here, and then it rises up and over the top to Bethany and Bethpage and their side. Okay, so that's the geography of this, and it's all quite tight. I always think that it's good when we get a sense of this. So this today is the church at the Garden of Gethsemane, and we'll see this now. This is Jesus praying on the rock, and here these are all olive trees. The Mount of Olives was at one point covered in olive trees, and this was where business is done. An olive grove, where that's to make olive oil, the primary cooking mode for folks back then. Here's the front of the church, you see here the disciples sleeping over here, and Jesus, and you'll see the angel above here. Oh, hang on. What's that? This is a huge mosaic. It's just simply gigantic. I'll show you on my cell phone. And here's the old olive trees, and here we are having a meditation, and with the last pilgrimage. One of the reasons I wanted to show you this picture, not me, and there's Dick and Molly, was just to show you, here's the Temple Mount, and where the temple would have been is right here. So you can see that when Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, he didn't actually go very far. This was not a long trip. And here's the inside. This is to my mind, a really stunning church. This is the mosaic behind the altar. And, I'll just show you this picture. This is a very powerful place. This is the rock that is venerated, where Jesus spent the night before his death. And here, this was a mass that was being said. Might even be said in Polish or something like that. And we snuck in almost illegally. It was really great. And Jeff and this might be Sarah Smith here. But, so that's what it all looks like today. And now let's hear what the scriptures have to say. So Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." So again, these are all passages that are very, very familiar to us because of the power they have. And I just wanted to put here, as usual, that this was how Jesus did it. So Jesus did not sleep in what we might think of as the old city of Jerusalem. He slept outside, on the side of the Mount of Olives, and then we get to see Jesus, the rhythm of Jesus' life. And then he withdraws to go pray. Remembering that Jesus goes and withdraws to go pray before every major thing that happens in his life. Jesus goes and prays. And so he is doing the same. Anybody with a comment about this? You may remember a few years ago when Martha was here, we did a thing called The Cup of Life. Wasn't that the name of the book? Yes. And Henry Nouwen also, that was a book written by a woman whose name is Ruff. She may be a nun, I can't remember. And Henry Nouwen wrote a book about the different ways that the word cup is used in the New Testament. I think there's 8 different ways that the word cup is used. But we're going to get to what this cup means a little bit. So here's a picture of Jesus, just a rendering of Jesus withdrawing while the disciples are over the hillside, falling asleep, right? And an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Why are you sleeping, he asked them. Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. Let me just show you a picture too. This is a painting that, to my mind, is actually so powerful. I was going to put it up in my office, and I simply decided I can't live with it. If you look at it closely, it's too awful to look at, but it is beautiful. But the movement of Jesus' hand here, this little part, way too painful. This is the most common painting in popular art of Jesus at the Rock. And then here, this is the rendering. See how these are rendered in time. You get the 3 disciples who are snoozing down here. Here's Peter in the middle. And Jesus is visited by an angel. He's not visited by an angel in all of the renderings of this. And here he is, and here is the cup. Remember Jesus says to James and John, the sons of Zebedee, will you be able to drink from the cup that I will drink? And they say yes, which is so bold. Then he says, yes, and you will. But here we go. Any thoughts on this? Yeah, Robin?
I'm looking at the paper that we got there on the churches. And it says, pray that you may not come into the time of trial. Whereas this one said in the beginning, you will not fall into temptation. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it's sort of ironic, trial and temptation.
Yeah, I'm wondering why we don't have it exactly the same. So there are differences here in the translations and in the different Gospels' treatment of the disciples. So pray that you will not come into the time of trial, which is right here, right? Trial and temptation. Lead us not into temptation. These questions of trial and temptation, I can't comment on any further than that.
But trial, he's going to have trial.
Yeah, I don't think that that's what they're referring to. I think it's referring to the trials and tribulations of what's coming.
Okay.
Yeah, Liz?
Can you flip back to the Gauguin for a minute?
Yeah. Oh, we go. Yeah, thank you.
It is fascinating.
It's fascinating to me that this is supposed to be Jesus because it's painted with red hair. And one of the tropes was that Judas had red hair. And I'm wondering what, for Gauguin, the symbolism of this was.
Oh, that is such a great question. Anybody have a shot at that? Who was a fine arts major? Could it be Judas? I don't believe so. I don't believe so.
I've seen the painting before, and it is Jesus.
Yes. I don't know. We can't. Anybody can channel Gauguin and get the answer directly. I don't know the answer, but I do know about the red hair in Judas. I thought of that. Yes.
Well, I wasn't a fine arts major. I just.
Oh, yeah, yes, of course you're a fine arts major. Yes, as you should have been, right?
Since being Van Gogh, I would just think maybe he had something to do with the paradox and opposites. Juxtaposition of the two.
Yeah.
Does that not look like a cap on his head with black a line underneath it?
Yeah, I thought
So
it was
not necessarily
it's a Van Gogh stylization of hair.
I think it looks like a kid from the village who dyed his hair orange. It looks like my old neighbor in the village.
Did Van Gogh have reddish hair? Yes.
So, interesting on these renderings, like where is the power in these things and the different, not to launch into art history here, but like the way angels are rendered and the way Jesus is rendered and look at Jesus' hands, for instance, here, how he's holding himself. And thy will be done, this is, of course, what's coming here, right? And now he's got his hands open. Now here is an anguish, right? And this one, he's, to my mind, so his humanity comes pouring forth. Ugh. I don't know. We couldn't find out. Beth found it on the web. We tried to track it down. It's just simply too painful. I'll just hold it there. I do want to go back here where it says they are asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Luke likes the disciples, right? So if you read through the Lucan account, he's very positive, relatively speaking, very positive of the disciples. And if you read Mark's version of it, the disciples are a band of losers, right? This is the messianic secret. The disciples never get it. They're always the last to get it. The demons get it before they do. Strangers get it before they do, and his closest followers are clueless. And here he has the men, these are men, exhausted from sorrow. And it's unclear in the telling of it how much they're actually grasping what's going on. You get the sense that actually things are happening to them at a faster rate than they're able to process, which is how life is, right? When you're entering into something that's really, really rough, for the most part it happens to us and we have to process it later. But they just had a Seder meal, right? And they got a lot of bad news and weird news. And so anyway, that's a positive take on this. So now it gets really ramped up here. And while he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" And I like the other translation where he goes, "Is it with a kiss?" Is it with a kiss that you betray the Son of Man? So I'm just going to take a look at this for a second here. Some of the intensity of the kiss. This is the kiss of death, right? That the mafia picked up, by the way. The kiss of death. Okay, what do you make of this? What do you make of Judas? Coming back to altar. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" Now, remember with that passage that we ended with about the two swords that later Justin gave me the answer to. We'll come back to the sword question. "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Now look at this. This is a grisly. Here we got the kiss, obviously, and here his ear is being cut off. Ouch, right? Okay, what do you make of this?
Before last week, time when they said death swords.
Yeah, pull that closer to you.
And they got two swords, and he said, "Enough." Like,
Enough.
enough already.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit overword on cutting off an ear.
Okay, so, yeah, one second. Justin, will you just say a little bit about I told Justin later, we were discussing the two swords, and you gave me some theology that had come up in the Middle Ages about the two swords. Could you just say a word about that?
So during the medieval period, as part of the theological discussions around the temporal authority or the political authority of the papacy, the saying about the two swords, they read it metaphorically. So two swords they think are given to the church, i.e. given to the Bishop of Rome and his successors. One is a temporal sword, and the other is a spiritual sword. So there are two kinds of authority that the Pope could wield: temporal, i.e. political, and spiritual. This seems to me to be cutting against the grain of what Jesus is actually doing in that passage. I mean, two swords to fight the entire Roman army, and he says it's enough. He must be about something other than telling them to take up arms. And we see the continuation of that teaching in this passage too.
Joe?
I was just struck, can you put the words back up there, the previous one? They're talking about cutting off his right ear, which is really a gruesome, grisly thing, and then Jesus healed him. And then I was thinking the crucifixion was much worse than that, and then Christ rose from that. So it's the misery and the healing, or the saving.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. So this is Jesus' last healing, right? I mean, in the scriptures we have Jesus doing the two primary things that he did was that he taught and he healed, right? And so this is his last healing, which is sort of, to my mind, kind of poignant and beautiful. Healing the person who's hurt over him.
Does anybody find it strange that to cut off an ear would require the skill of a surgeon? And is there some symbolism around it being the right ear, as if these people have not heard the word of God?
Oh, wow. Everybody hear that? Rick is talking about is there any symbolism in the right ear, and whether or not it's hearing the word? All these, Jesus' phrase. Rick, this is really interesting. All those who have ears, hear. One of those, Jesus is saying his kind of phrase for, hey, listen up. And now this guy doesn't have an ear. I don't know.
But then the symbolism of it healing the ear, because he still wants them to be able to hear.
You should write like a commentary. Don't you think so? Could write a commentary.
Was that something that was done back then, that people would just be delimbed for, something?
They're in a fight. It's a street fight.
Take off something.
I used to live in Columbia. I lived on the floor. My closest friend is a doctor, and he was when he went to Columbia Presbyterian, and after they all got done with their work days, there was a lot of guys I went to college with in school, and they would sit around and drink beer. I shouldn't say that because it's being filmed. But anyway, they would share the stories of what happened in the emergency room while they were drinking beer. I thought this was kind of a gruesome and grisly way to unwind. But anyway, they would talk about all of the fights that would happen up at Washington Square Park up there. There was a big drug deal up there. There was a lot of fighting that would take place. And people get hurt. And I think this was a chaotic fight. And it broke out and, like a random swipe. And I think he got hurt. And remember that we're talking about the temple guard, right? This is not Roman soldiers. This is the religious authorities and their temple guard. This is like the guard at the Vatican, right? Those of you who've been to the Vatican, all the guys with little earpiece. These are the guys with the earpiece. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders. Okay, so you see we have there the chief priest. There is one chief priest, I might add. That's Caiaphas. We're going to get to Caiaphas. The chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him. Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns. Okay, darkness, right? This is darkness reigning. Okay, what do you think?
Well, actually, what popped into my mind in reading this was that people who use Christianity for, wars, and it just stuck in my mind that he's going, am I leading a rebellion? That you come with swords and clubs? So it's kind of like ISIS or other, groups who use religion. You go, well, you should look at this because Jesus didn't even want someone's ear to be cut off, so that the horrible things like executing people aren't in line with kind of.
Okay, so that is an incredibly deep and true statement. There's a book written by he's not dead, but was at Yale, Yaroslav Pelikan, and he wrote this book called Jesus Through the Centuries, and he's a scholar of great heft, and he looked at how Jesus had been used by different cultures and through time, and one of the conclusions he draws is that he's talking about people reading into Jesus what they want, and so you can have like the liberal Jesus, the conservative Jesus, the social justice Jesus, the liberator, Jesus, the lover of women, the Jesus, the gay Jesus. These are some of the Jesuses that have come up in recent time. And the manipulation and use of Jesus for different ends. And the answer is yes, Jesus is used for all sorts of things. And back to Justin's earlier comments about the two swords, and the questions around the Crusades, for instance, and all what that led to. And yet Jesus is, as you're saying, well, you've completely misunderstood me. That's very interesting. Yeah, Liz.
It's very interesting that through the centuries, there have been many interpretations of why Judas did what he did.
Yeah.
And one of the theories is that he wanted Jesus to foment a rebellion. And this was his way of starting it, by setting Jesus up and in the hope that Jesus would in fact lead a rebellion and for once in his life act like a military leader that the Messiah was expected to be. So I think it's very interesting that here Jesus says, do you think I'm leading a rebellion? Because that puts a stop to later speculation that maybe he was supposed to be, in his own mind, supposed to be leading a rebellion.
Yeah. Wow. This is why Jesus is so uncategorizable. And remember, exegesis is what comes out of the text, and eisegesis is what we put into the text. And there's also a book written about, another book written about Judas that says that one of the reasons Judas turned Jesus in is he was on Jesus' team. He just didn't like the way he was going about his business, and he wanted to reel him in. So again, it's really, it's the question of sort of pious speculation to try to understand, and that the Scripture doesn't tell us other than that God put it in His heart to do this, right? So we don't know.
This other little booklet has, have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? So it's making it individual rather than, a whole group of people. He's saying, as if I were a bandit.
Yeah.
Bandits don't always lead rebellions.
Yeah.
It's a personal kind of.
Yeah.
Which translation is this one?
So I would have guessed it was the same. So I can't answer that.
No. Where does this one
I thought it was the NRSV Luke, which is, but I guess it's, I guess it's not. Let me just say that. Anybody else? Nancy?
I see it back on another page, but,
I'm back on a different page, but I always wondered a little bit why Judas needed to identify Jesus with the kiss, because wasn't there it says, hey, I've been in the temples and all these other places, and now you've chosen to come get me. Didn't the authorities know who he was?
Yeah, that's kind of one of those quizzical things. Yeah, why do you need to, it's pretty clear who he is. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it was dark. Talking about different passages here and different takes, and I'm sorry that the translation, that I'm unclear about the translation. I thought that we had the NRSV here. In Luke.
I think you're using the NIV.
That's,
Just FYI.
Okay.
The booklet uses the NRSV.
Yeah, okay, so thanks, Justin, for sorting that out. So, in what is the New International Version, is that the NIV? Yeah, that's the default setting in Bible Gateway, that's what we've got. Yeah, Bill?
I think that last part means that they really were very much afraid of him. And they were afraid to do anything in daylight because of the possibility that the population behind him would cause trouble. So he said, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you lay a hand on me, during the day?
Right.
And you come during the night, and I think that's why. And I think they're scared to death of it, and he's scared of the movement that they think he's going to lead.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, the scriptures lead us to that point. Thank you for saying so. I mean, they avoid him during the day because of the multitude, right? That's the word that's used. The multitude that are for him, so they don't want to create a big thing by coming out. And they don't know what to expect. What happens in Mark's gospel at this point? Let's see with it. So we're talking about different takes in the scriptures. What happened? Anybody know from Mark's gospel? There's another thing that happens in this moment. This was on my general ordination exam. Okay, so now I feel like I should ask the clergy in the back, but. I just say I didn't get it right on my general ordination exam. I think Ann Richard probably was just like disgusted that I didn't get it. She was the person who read my exam. Okay, so in Mark's gospel, remember each of these stories is different. In Mark's gospel, there's a guy who is sleeping when the guards come, and what does he do? He runs away. What is particular about his running away? He's naked, right? Which I just love. That's like my favorite part of all Mark's gospel. Right after Jesus says, 6:30, come away to a deserted place and rest a while. That's my favorite line in the whole gospel. But my second favorite line is this guy runs away naked, which to my mind has to do with, and scholars believe that's Mark, who's running away naked, and he's putting his little thumbprint in it to say, I was there, but I wouldn't see all of it because he was scared and he took off. You guys all grew up in nice neighborhoods, but I mean, you ever be at a fight or a congregation, and you hear police coming, and what do? The smart person runs away, right? So this is my sign of intelligence for Mark here, hitting the road. But anyway, the nakedness of it, a little bit like he was on a seat in the back of the boat, right, in the stilling of the storm. They gathered up 12 baskets, or all these questions, these little particularities that we find in the gospel stories, which point toward the story's authenticity in Luke. So anyway, we don't get that in Luke. We don't have any naked guys running around. Okay, then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, This man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him, he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, you also are one of them. Man, I am not, Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. And Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Yes, you're right. I can see now I don't have the same translation we used to work with. Because usually that says, and you will deny me 3 times. Okay, so just a few pieces of art. Here they are, back to this portion. And they seized him and took him to the house of the high priest. Okay, so here we have entering into the house of the high priest, and this is the chamber in the house of the high priest. Here's the place that is venerated in the Holy Land today as this place. You know, every significant thing that happened in Jesus' life has a place where it is venerated. Doesn't mean where it happened, but where it is venerated. This is, St. Peter of the crowing cock, right? This is a picture of the church, the top of the church. So the valley here sort of bends around, and Jerusalem is over here. Jerusalem is, and Mount of Olives is over here. So this is kind of where they brought him to the place of the high priest. And outside, this doesn't really do it justice. But if you stand in front of this sculpture and you see the look on their faces, oh my gosh, he looks like a human being. And there's another 2 sculptures there. There's 3 sculptures where Peter denied him, and the sculptures, one after another, was more powerful. Very, very powerful in the courtyards outside the house. And here's a rendering or 2 that get, look at the intensity of that. I mean, you can see on his face, me? No. Look at this one. Look at his hands right in here. Ooh. No. I mean, that is like the perfect denial. And rendered in a different way, then rendered in some Italian's version of this. And how about this? The art world has really gotten Peter denying. And then here he weeps bitterly. Okay, you make that. This is denial. Not the betrayal, but the denial of Jesus.
How is it that he was taken in custody with the assistance of the Roman centurions and they go to the house of the priest?
Yeah, it's actually not with the centurions, it's with the temple guard. Yeah. It's basically the police department.
This action, we know that Peter is impulsive. We know that he tends to say the wrong thing, think the wrong thing, do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
This is the ultimate in doing the wrong thing. On the other hand, he saved his own life by doing it.
You should have been a lawyer. My client is totally guilty, but what a great thing that he is guilty. I know a lot of people that could use a lawyer in Washington these days, so maybe you have another job for you in the courtrooms of the world here. So I mean, Peter, it's hard. Peter does a lot of stuff wrong. I mean, and this is the 3 denials, right? That at the end of John's Gospel, Jesus is prideful. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Right? Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my sheep. Right? So that's which we get the undoing of Peter's denials and the cleansing of his soul and the building of him up.
Well, and then also that story
story is really about grace too, because if someone like Peter makes a mistake like that, and how badly he feels afterwards, and we think about our own lives when we mess up, and we're remorseful, but then there's grace.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting. I mean, if you take a look at religious foundations and formations and who we hold up, and all the mistakes that Peter makes impulsive. I'm sure that Peter had ADD. He seems unable to stay too focused on anything for very long, and would have been a really difficult kid in grade school. I bet he was totally out of control in the early days. And though he does all this stuff wrong, he becomes the rock, right? Cephas the rock. But anyway, and I guess just noting our own tradition that, given the tradition that we now live in, has a powerful motion in it that swirls around the 8th, and who one could say, oh, that wasn't such a good move. It doesn't kind of hold up, and I mean, it does lead to a kind of humility that, we have this, I mean, Paul says we have this grace in earthen jars, right? And so, I mean, who amongst us, even our leaders, isn't just a completely Adam, earth-footed character? We're all earth-footed characters.
But when you think about this situation, I mean, we look at it like us, where we're 2,000 years later and Christ is accepted and you go, oh, how could he do that? But when you think about even now, things that go wrong, how many of us had the courage to stand up for something that's so against what everybody else believes and so uncertain? So, you question yourself. Like, I totally think that the denying and the turning him in feeds into, did I get this right? Am I, creating a monster? Am I, you would just be going through this in your mind. And so I just have great, great sympathy for these characters. Like, how would I ever know? And would I listen to the voice of God, or would I go, oh, wow, am I getting psychotic? Am I, truly, I mean, you would be questioning your own sanity, like, am I on something here?
Okay, so, thank you for that. How about this? And we're going to move on to the next thing. So, how about this? When's the last time you were at a dinner party and somebody said something so offensive that you were just shocked by it? Yeah. And you just took a pass and didn't say anything. I mean, we are all Peter, and most of us are Peter in the extreme. And we don't stand up for our Lord, all the time. And so I have no problem. This is, in my mind, is one of the most, this is the easiest sin in the world for me to understand. I totally get this one.
I don't see Judas and Peter, though, in the same way. Was Judas not paid to betray him?
Okay, so Judas gets the 30 shekels and in the betrayal. Yeah, I mean, betrayal and denial have a different voltage around all this. I'm with you on that. Yeah, Justin? Eileen.
I'm just thinking how Jesus...
I'm going to wait for the mic on.
Thinking about how Jesus must have felt. Just thinking about he was sold for 30 shekels. He was, his apostles fell asleep on him in the garden. He couldn't stay awake. He's betrayed with a kiss. Yeah. And then Peter, who he loved and taught and just adored, now betrays him 3 times. We know enough that he probably knew this was coming. Well, he knew this was coming, but and all for God's will, for his Father's will in heaven. But to be so alone with all that, it must. If Peter wept bitterly, I can only imagine that Jesus wanted to, because he heard the denials.
Okay, so there's a piece of art that didn't make it in here. It just somehow didn't make it, was I think it's a Da Vinci drawing of Jesus looking at Peter. As it says here, he looks straight at Peter. Oh, this is crippling that Peter's looked at. Listen. Now, just given time, yes, thank you for that, Eileen. And you know, what are Jesus' emotions throughout all of this? So it really kind of goes from bad to worse, right? The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. The other passage, prophesy, prophesy. We hear this. So this is just a few renderings of Jesus blindfolded and sort of taunted here.
Wait, if you go back to that first, sorry, the picture, one more. We had right here. One more. Keep going. Yeah. Is he not over? Is he not?
Yeah, boy, this looks almost like it's out of the Dutch school, doesn't it? I didn't take fine arts 150, so I missed that. I don't know what's happening. I can't explain it right here, but I know somebody will come back next week and have it all sorted out. So thank you.
There are only stories. There are only stories about Peter and Judas. So there were none of the other disciples are singled out for saying something about Jesus or betraying him or.
It's a Peter Judas story here. The others boogie. I mean, Mark runs away naked, and the others.
Yeah, I thought those are the only ones. It's interesting that they're.
Well, yeah, and so the Gospels don't agree on a bunch of things. One of the things they don't. We're going to get to this next week, but they don't agree on when the trial before the Sanhedrin took place. Some of them have it on Friday morning. Some of them have it on Thursday night. It's against Jewish law to have a trial in the evening. So there was a lot written about that, and remember, as we move forward and everybody falls away, Peter sticks. The good news is Peter sticks with them for a while here, but then he gets into the denial business. And then, of course, what we end up hearing is it's really the women who stick with Jesus, and at the crucifixion, which is we're coming to that. The only people at the crucifixion are the women. Who followed him, and in John's Gospel, the beloved disciple. So, but the so-called 12, they're not so great at this. Anybody ever see? We're going to finish. Oh, we have to finish The Last Temptation of Christ. Anyone ever see that movie? Yeah, we can talk about that. What is the theology behind a movie where they show Jesus being beaten? I went to the movie with my son Sam at the Shaker Square Theater in Ohio, and Sam was in 5th grade, and he looked at me and he said, "This is a ridiculous movie." Sort of interesting. He said, "I don't see what." I don't get. I mean, he's a 5th grader, and he's like, I don't get. And why did he use the word piety? I don't get that this idea that the harder that Jesus is beaten up, the more of a sinner that I am, and the more he's forgiven me. And he's a 5th grader saying that. But we can get to that. We can get to that next week because we're going to do the crucifixion next week. Okay, everybody, time to be quiet for me. Thanks everybody for coming. So touched that you made time to come to this.